also say that I have doubts and difficult relationships, and I know that you do also. So sorry if that messes things up for you. We are different people from different places and backgrounds. I'm going to move through this pretty quick because I think hopefully everything else in the service to this point has kind of gotten us where we need to be. And if you want more on this, we'll do it at Occupy on Tuesday. We're different people from different places and backgrounds. So we're different. We don't believe the same things in the same ways. We don't hold all of the same convictions with the same veracity or place the same emphasis on the same values with exactly the same intensity. We're different. And yet there is a beauty in that diversity, a necessity in that difference that enables us, I think, to uniquely be who we are and do what we do as a body, to use Paul's language. Somebody wrote on the crowdsourced poster board, I love this, we're a quilt with different colorful patches and very cozy, which I think we are. The John Smith video is brilliant, right? Where we share a name, collective, and yet within that name is harbored this phenomenal diversity of stories and backgrounds and personalities and convictions that have all sort of been brought together. And it is the gifts of this difference that I think enable us to embody this community, to really function and thrive. The Gospels agree that Jesus' ministry begins with the calling of the disciples, and I found this book at Barnes & Noble, Stacy and I were there this week, that was like this extensive, it was like fat, just on the historical background of like what can be known about the disciples. And I was shocked as I read through this by how different they were. And even though they're all from like a relatively small area in the ancient Near East, how radically different their background was from one another. Jesus' entire entourage was people from different places and backgrounds, geographically, religiously, culturally, socioeconomically, politically, in terms of their prominence and their personality, and even their commitment to the movement. There was like the 12 and then like the inner circle. We talked a couple weeks ago in the Exodus story about that the Israelites, as they leave, it says they leave with a mixed multitude. And the Hebrew word is erev rav, which I think would best translate into English as like a motley crew. This is like anyone and everyone. Basically, everyone that doesn't want to be slaves gets to go. And so this is like a band of misfits, not Israelites, not just this sort of very clearly distinguishable, singular kind of people, but everybody, and even including animals. Thor's here, right? Is Thor here? Not tonight. Usually Thor's here, who's a dog. And shout out to Peachy. Peachy's another dog who's been here, watching from Sweden, I'm sure. The point is, they leave Egypt, right, to embark on this journey, and there's no TSA checkpoint. There's no passport verification. There's no declaration of items. There's no background check for travel visas. Regardless of difference, regardless of background, everybody's welcome on this journey. There's this theory called centered set versus bonded set, or wells and fences, which actually came about through farming. And the idea is that many farmers would fence in their land to keep their livestock in and keep other livestock out. But what they learned in Australia is that on these massive ranches called stations, the fence really became pointless. The land was so vast that much of the livestock would never actually even see the boundary of the land. They'd never get to the edge of the property. And so it was just as feasible that the livestock would get lost and die on the property within the fence. And so instead, they started drilling wells. And they found that fences or not, the livestock would wander as far as they wanted to, but they would never wander so far that they couldn't come back to the well, where they were finding the source of life, this company of other animals that were surviving together. And so the idea applied to churches or faith communities offers really a heavy critique, but then also a pretty beautiful vision. The critique, I think, is that the modern church project has been predominantly in the fencing business, sort of playing the role of the gatekeeper of who's in and who's out, who gets access to God, to community, to the shared spiritual formation of congregational life, and then who doesn't. You're either sort of in or out of the fence. But the beautiful vision that I think is celebrated in the idea of the well is that it can be approached from an infinite combination of distances and directions. And I know for me this is true, I hope this is what we mean to affirm in this line of the community statement, that we don't build fences. We drill wells. Whoever you are, wherever you're from, whatever your background, come on. That's what that says. And without fences, We no longer have to build boundaries based on in or out, Christian or non-Christian, lost or saved, slave or free, Jew or Greek, male or female. Whatever the binary we want to create, we don't have to do that anymore. Because the unconditional hospitality of Christian community claims that all are one by pointing to a universal a universal Christ, rather than building an exclusive fence and saying some in, some out. And when there are no fences, it simply means that the well can be approached from this infinite combination of distances and directions, from the 360 degrees of difference, diversity, place, and background from which any of us come. So I sat down this week, and I was like, okay, different people, different places and backgrounds, diversity. I just started kind of writing. I ended up with 2 pages. Just in collective, this is a small room, this is not a big congregation. The diversity gathered just around this well, humor me. Christians of all stripes. Greek Orthodox, Methodist, Pentecostal, Episcopal, Quaker, Catholic, Presbyterian, house church, megachurch, mainline, evangelical, if I left you out, I'm sorry. Ministers of all stripes. Methodist ministers, Presbyterian ministers, UCC ministers, Unity ministers, Unitarian ministers, if I left you out, I'm sorry. Homeschoolers, Christian schoolers, public schoolers, a plurality of other religious traditions, from Buddhist to Baha'i, Hindu, Eastern spirituality and meditation, Wiccan, Jews, pagans, spiritualists, those entirely non-religious, atheists, agnostics, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, Democrat, Republican, libertarian, Green Party, rich, poor, successful, homeless, varying degrees of physical, mental, or social disability, recovering and functional alcoholics, recovering and functional addicts, depression, mental illness, everything from little tiny babies to people in their final season of life. You may not know this, and I'm glad you're all sitting. In addition to coffee people, there are tea people in this room. Everybody belongs. Everybody. There are cat people. Vegetarians, carnivores, highly educated, totally uneducated. White folks, people of color, some ethnic, social, cultural minorities. In this place, it would be lunacy to even begin to think that we could all approach life or faith or spirituality or meaning in the same way, from the same place, with the same posture. We bring ourselves and our backgrounds, and they are so different. So different. And here's one of the tricks, though. The background and the place that I think many of us come from is actually a church or a religion or a family, maybe, of fences, of this tribal mentality about who's in and who's out. So this is a great sort of, Jim and Bill pointed this out. One of the dangers is that we move beyond that, but then we end up scapegoating those people. We go, oh, those fence people with their black and white exclusive beliefs, they don't fit in this generous, open, wells kind of community, so we're just going to build a little fence. Keep out the fence people. And what this is to transcend and regress. Like, oh, we're beyond that, but then we're actually going to do the same thing that we claim to have moved beyond. And I'm talking to myself because this is my background, and I did this for a long time, and I probably still do in many ways. The only way to actually approach this well of generosity and inclusion and unconditional hospitality is to transcend and include. To move beyond that fenced-in background from which you've come, to transcend that, but then also to acknowledge that you have to find a way to include that past. You have to include those people. All of that gets folded in because all of that is a part of how you approach this well from whatever that background is. That's a part of it. You can't fence that out. That's who you are and where you come from. But we can't scapegoat. We don't want to name a needed enemy or point to a point of contrast to make our group appear right or good. And this continues to come up. We've been doing this now for years. We don't need to define ourselves by who we're not, by building more fences, because we know who we are. We know, as a community, the well from which we drink, how we approach this well of life, this well of spirit, of meaning that's harbored in the name of God, that's witnessed in the way of Christ. William Stafford, in just the first stanza of one of his poems, he says, if you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. And I think we have to acknowledge that it is not enough to celebrate that we come from different places and backgrounds. That's actually a given, right? The question is whether or not we will actually know one another, whether we'll practice the vulnerability, what Pete calls that suspended identity of a liturgical space, so that we can actually know each other. Because otherwise, we inevitably recreate the pattern that others made, in this case, fenced-in communities of who's in and who's out. And following the wrong God home, that tribal God of sameness, of safety and familiarity, of fear and self-preservation, we may follow that God home, that pattern, build our fences, and totally miss that star. Now, I painted with some broad strokes, and I think we need to be careful not to overly romanticize this diversity. It's important, it's true of this community. But Jim pointed this out. Diversity clearly has great potential for enrichment, but that potential can also be swamped by conflict, and yet there doesn't seem to be a lot of conflict at Collective. And so he asked, is there not as much diversity as we think? Or is Collective especially adept at minimizing conflict? I think the diversity is here, as I've already named, but I don't for a second think that we are immune to the conflict that will come. In any organization, in any community, conflict is inevitable. But how we handle it is a matter of the formation and the shape of this community. I love this quote. Mary Carr says, "Dysfunctional family is any family with more than one person in it." Yeah, and that's like a dysfunctional church. It's just two people hanging out. So even though Collective is only, in its current form, is only a handful of years old, if you stick around long enough, we will become dysfunctional, like any other group of people who spend time together, and I want to emphasize this, who spend time together in deep ways. Beyond the pleasantries, beyond the acquaintances, beyond, how's it going? Good. Good, everything's good. When you spend time together in deep ways, if we really risk knowing one another and sticking around, it will get dysfunctional. We will have to fight and to forgive and to compromise and to repair relationships and to heal wounds, because that is a part of being human together. That's the only way to be human together. But culture has trained the modern churchgoer, if you don't like someone or something, you get offended or someone hurts your feelings, you just leave. You find another church, or you quit church, or you quit God, and that's a whole thing now. It's a movement. And a part of us naming this diversity in our community statement every week and holding that forward and asking it to stand out, I think it does a few things. First, it says we're not all supposed to be the same. But in fact, we're different, and it's okay to remain different. The point of coming to a church, of being a part of a community of faith, is not for everyone to be the same. So conflict, aim at conquering or colonizing or forcing uniformity, is pointless, and it is unkind, and it is unwelcome. I think that's a part of what we're saying when we say we're different people from different places, backgrounds. And this names the reality that we are going to have to practice something much more difficult and much more radical than leaving. Jesus calls it forgiveness. Because I'm going to let you down. Absolutely. The people sitting next to you in these chairs will let you down. The leaders of the community groups will let you down. The band is going to sing something in a song, and you're going to take it the wrong way. There's going to be something in your discussion group, and someone's going to share their opinion, and it's not going to be your opinion, and it's going to be offensive. Forgiveness isn't a feeling that we get to have when it's convenient or when someone asks for it. Part of practicing forgiveness, part of our value in diversity, means that you decide now that when that day comes and you're pissed and you're hurt and you're bored or whatever, you don't just walk away. Part of forgiveness means you decide now to bring it up. You hash it out. You trust us enough to work through it together. Because difference will inevitably mean difference of opinion, will inevitably mean disagreement. But we can be community through that. And I think the only way we can actually be a real community is through that. That's a part of being human together. We can learn to fight as friends rather than enemies. I love that phrase Pete uses in the video. That's actually the only way to maintain diversity. That's the only way that we can actually celebrate difference over any period of time, because if all the difference leaves, you end up with this homogenous community of sameness. Gross. Oh yeah, I agree. That's... gross. So let's not overly romanticize it. But beyond that, and even more, the pushback, the critique, the deconstruction, the disagreement is actually a necessary component of what we're doing. I would say we intentionally diversify against groupthink, which may sound weird because for so long, Christian discipleship has meant getting on the conveyor belt and coming out the end, believing and behaving and answering and, right? Everyone should be the same. But I actually think the spiritual practice of dissent, of doubt, of critique, of disrupting groupthink is far more faithful to the life and the way of Jesus than the popular version. He doesn't get killed for towing the party line, right? He gets killed for subverting the acceptable hive mind, for presenting another way. This well that exists beneath and just under the noses of the fences of empire and religion. When we first named and branded Collective, this is about 4 years ago, 4.5, we got two main comments, and these were both hilarious. The first were from Cold War era Eastern European baby boomers who were fit to be tied because I named an American Christian church Collective. Apparently, I didn't know this, there were some communist connections to Collective Farms. Who knew? I took AP American history twice, no European. So the other comment was naturally from Star Trek. And I was a huge Star Trek fanboy, super nerd, Next Generation, Jean-Luc Picard. And this may be one of those moments where you decide to leave the church, and I get it. Starship Enterprise NC-1701D user manual. That's a fictional spacecraft, by the way, but I had the user manual for it. Anyway, the Borg, these are some characters, also called the Borg Collective. It's like this lemming, zombie, hive mind, cyborg horde that just travels through the galaxy, assimilating people to their hive mind, into their groupthink. Your biological and technological distinctiveness will be added to our own. You will be assimilated. No, got it. Honestly, usually that line kills, but edit the rest of this out. One of their catchphrases was "resistance is futile." Right? You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. And so when people started making this connection, like, oh, Collective, Star Trek, and I was like, yes. We were like, Clark and I were talking about we should do this T-shirt campaign. We put like the Collective logo on one side, and then on the back it would say, "Resistance is fertile." That's right. Those are my people in the back. I'll take booze as long as you help me to know that I'm heard. But this idea that questioning, critique, and pushback, and difference and diversity that prevents us from becoming this amorphous, sort of homogenous blob of sameness, that is the fertile soil for spiritual development, for human development, for personal growth, for making a meaningful life in a community of significance, right? Jesus isn't killed for falling in line, for assimilating, for coloring within the lines and playing by the rules. He and his friends are killed and persecuted for resistance, for the ways that they're challenging and knocking down fences and pointing instead to wells, for eating and drinking with people from different places and different backgrounds. As I looked at the backgrounds of the 12 disciples this week, I found myself thinking, I cannot imagine the diversity of experience, the emotions and reactions among Jesus' friends when he first broke the bread and poured the wine, and when they realized what that meant, like where this thing was going. How differently each of them must have understood and interpreted and experienced that moment. So he says, "This is my body." And this is my blood. He says, when you do this, remember me. with such diversity present, is there any way he could have guaranteed that they would all remember him the same? That they'd all remember the same thing in the same way and would lead to the same belief, the same emotion? There's no way. There's no way. Breaks bread. He says, when you do this, and you're going to do this, every time you do this, remember me. And I started thinking, he trusts them. He trusts them in all of the complexity of their diversity, the radical differences that they brought into that space. Jesus believes in them. He has faith in them to have their experience and to share it with each other. The table of love that is deep enough and broad enough to hold the complexity of all of our diversity. This table which represents the unbound well of welcome. Table of unity without uniformity has been set. As always, it is open to us, and it is open to all people, and no one will ever be turned away. If you would like, when you're ready, you can come and grab a piece of bread and dip it in the cup.